The sky bled crimson as Garrett Wade stared at the ruins of his life, the muddy waters of the North Platte River still swirling around what remained of his homestead. His hat dripped water onto his shoulders as he stood ankle-deep in the receding flood that had taken everything he'd built over the past 7 years. It was the spring of 1876, and the winter's heavy snow, combined with 3 days of relentless rain, had caused the worst flooding Wyoming Territory had seen in decades. Garrett's cabin was gone, washed downstream along with his barn, livestock, and every possession that hadn't been strapped to his horse when he'd fled to higher ground. "Ain't nothing left," he muttered to himself, his voice rough from disuse and the whiskey he'd consumed the night before while huddled under an outcropping of rock. His stallion, Thunder, nickered softly behind him, perhaps the only friend he had left in this God-forsaken territory. At 32, Garrett had seen his share of hardships. The war had left him with nightmares and a slight limp from a rebel bullet at Shiloh. He'd come west to escape those memories, to build something that was his alone. Now, it seemed fate had other ideas. He mounted Thunder and turned away from the devastation. He had $2 in his pocket, a Colt revolver on his hip, a Winchester rifle in its scabbard, and the clothes on his back still damp from his attempt to salvage anything from the floodwaters. Heading toward the settlement of Whispering Pines some 20 miles east seemed his only option. The trail was muddy and treacherous. Twice, Thunder nearly lost his footing on the slick path. By nightfall, Garrett was still 10 miles from town, and the spring air carried a biting chill as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. In the distance, a faint light flickered through the trees. A homestead, perhaps. Somewhere he might find shelter for the night. He nudged Thunder toward it, hope kindling for the first time that day. The property was modest, but well kept, a small cabin with a covered porch, a barn, and a corral. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a lantern hung by the door. Garrett approached cautiously, aware that strangers weren't always welcome, especially after dark. He dismounted, wincing as his bad leg protested, and approached the door. Before he could knock, it swung open, revealing a woman holding a shotgun pointed squarely at his chest. "State your business," she said firmly, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Garrett raised his hand slowly. "Madam, I don't mean any trouble. Name's Garrett Wade. Lost my place in the flood upriver. Just looking for a place to shelter for the night. Happy to sleep in your barn if you're willing." The woman studied him for a long moment. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps in her late 20s, with honey-brown hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her eyes were the color of sage, and despite her hard expression, there was something in them that spoke of a deep sadness. "You're soaked through," she finally said, lowering the shotgun slightly. "And half starved by the look of you." She stepped back from the doorway. "Come in before you catch your death. You can tend to your horse after you've warmed up." "Much obliged," Garrett said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. The cabin was warm and smelled of freshly baked bread. A pot bubbled over the fire, and the simple furnishings were neat and well cared for. It was the home of someone who took pride in what little they had. "Zara Thomas," she offered, setting the shotgun against the wall, but still within easy reach. "My husband's buried on the hill yonder. Been on my own these past 2 years." A widow. That explained the sadness in her eyes and the cautious way she'd greeted him. A woman alone in these parts had every reason to be wary. "Sorry for your loss, Mrs. Thomas," Garrett said sincerely. "Just, Zara is fine." She gestured to a chair by the fire. "Sit. I'll fetch you some dry clothes. My husband's things are still in the trunk. They might be a bit small, but they're dry." Garrett hesitated. "I should see to my horse first. The barn's just outside. Stall on the left is empty. There's grain in the bin. 10 minutes to care for your animal, then you come right back in, you hear? You look about ready to fall over." There was a note of authority in her voice that brooked no argument. Garrett nodded and went to tend to Thunder, grateful for the woman's unexpected kindness. When he returned, Zara had laid out clothes on a chair and was stirring the pot over the fire. "Change behind that screen," she instructed, nodding toward a wooden partition in the corner. "Then we'll get some food in you." The clothes were indeed a bit small. The previous owner had been shorter than Garrett's 6'1" frame, but they were clean and dry. He emerged feeling more human than he had in days. "Thank you kindly," he said, sitting at the small table where Zara had set out a bowl of stew and a chunk of bread. "Eat," she commanded, taking the seat across from him. Then you can tell me what happened. Garrett didn't need to be told twice. The stew was rich with vegetables and bits of rabbit, the bread still warm from the oven. He ate with the hunger of a man who hadn't had a proper meal in days. The river took everything, he said between bites, explaining how the waters had risen so quickly he'd barely had time to saddle Thunder and escape. 7 years of work, gone in an afternoon. Zara listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful. When he finished both his story and his meal, she refilled his bowl without asking. You're welcome to the barn for a few days, she said. Until you figure out your next move. I'll work for my keep, Garrett insisted. I noticed your fence needs mending, and that barn roof could use some patching. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. I won't turn down the help. That night, Garrett slept on clean hay in the barn, wrapped in borrowed blankets. For the first time since the flood, he fell asleep without the weight of despair crushing his chest. He had a temporary reprieve, at least. Morning came with the crow of a rooster and the soft light of dawn filtering through the barn's wooden slats. Garrett rose, stretched his stiff muscles, and set about tending to Thunder before making his way to the cabin, where smoke already rose from the chimney. Zara stood at the stove, frying eggs and bacon. She'd changed her dress and redone her braid. But the dark circles under her eyes suggested a restless night. Good morning, Garrett said, removing his hat as he entered. She nodded in acknowledgement. Hope you're hungry. Always am for a breakfast like that. He paused, then added, I meant what I said about working. Just point me where you need me most. After breakfast, Zara showed him around the property. It was modest but well planned, 20 acres of land with a small orchard, a vegetable garden waiting to be planted for the spring, and a few chickens clucking around the yard. She explained that she sold eggs and preserves in town to supplement what her husband had left her. Jacob, my husband, he had plans to expand, she said, her voice softening at the mention of his name. Wanted to add more acreage, maybe raise some cattle. The fever took him before he could. Garrett nodded sympathetically. It's a good piece of land. You've maintained it well on your own. Had to, she said simply. No one else was going to do it for me. The next few days fell into a rhythm. Garrett worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, patching the barn roof, and clearing new ground for Zara to expand her garden. She cooked meals that reminded him of his mother's cooking back in Ohio, and in the evenings they sat by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes sharing a comfortable silence. Garrett learned that Zara had come west with Jacob 5 years earlier, full of dreams for their future. They'd been childhood sweethearts from a small town in Pennsylvania. No children had blessed their union, a fact that seemed to carry its own particular sorrow for her. In turn, he told her about his time in the war, his journey west, and the homestead he'd built by the river. He spoke of his plans to raise horses, perhaps start a proper ranch someday. You'll build again, she said one evening, as they sat drinking coffee after supper. You seem the type that doesn't stay down for long. Thought crosses my mind, he admitted, but starting over from nothing, it's a daunting prospect. Nothing is exactly what Jacob and I had when we arrived, she pointed out. Just a wagon full of belongings and enough money for the land claim. The conversation shifted to other topics, but Garrett found himself watching Zara more closely. Despite her initial wariness, there was a strength to her that he admired. She carried her grief with dignity, never letting it prevent her from moving forward. A week into his stay, Garrett rode into Whispering Pines with Zara to sell her eggs and check if any mail had arrived for him. The town was small but bustling, with a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and a handful of other businesses lining its single street. As they tied their horses outside the general store, a tall man in a suit approached, his expression souring when he spotted Zara. Mrs. Thomas, he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated politeness. I trust you've reconsidered my offer? Zara's back stiffened. Mr. Bellamy, my answer remains the same. I'm not selling. The man's gaze shifted to Garrett, taking in his presence with obvious disapproval. I see you found help. Mr. Wade is a neighbor who lost his property in the flood, Zara said coolly. He's been kind enough to assist with repairs. Bellamy's smile didn't reach his eyes. How fortunate for you, though I must say, a woman alone maintaining that property is still impractical. My offer stands at $300. You won't get better. "The property's not for sale at any price, Mr. Bellamy," Zara reiterated. Garrett stood silently, observing the exchange with growing unease. There was something predatory in the way Bellamy looked at both Zara and her land. "Very well." Bellamy adjusted his suit jacket. "Good day to you both." He walked away, disappearing into the saloon across the street. "Friend of yours?" Garrett asked once Bellamy was out of earshot. Zara's laugh was without humor. "Hardly. Edgar Bellamy owns the bank and half the businesses in town. He's been trying to buy my land since a month after Jacob died." She sighed. "He wants to expand his cattle operation and claims my property is the perfect addition." Inside the general store, the proprietor, a friendly man named Davis, greeted them warmly. "Miss Zara, your timing's perfect. Just got a shipment of those sewing needles you've been waiting for." As Zara conducted her business, Garrett inquired about mail and any news of other flood victims. There was no mail for him, but Davis confirmed what he'd feared. Several homesteads along the river had been completely destroyed, and at least 2 people had drowned. "You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Wade," Davis said, shaking his head. "Though lucky might not be how you're feeling about now." On the ride back to Zara's place, they discussed what they'd learned in town. Garrett was quiet, processing the news of the deaths and considering his options. "You're welcome to stay longer," Zara said suddenly, breaking the silence. "The work you've done, it's made a real difference, and there's plenty more to be done if you're willing." Garrett looked over at her, surprised by the offer. "That's mighty generous of you." "It's not just generosity," she admitted. "Having you there, it's been good to have another soul around. The silence gets heavy sometimes." Her honesty touched something in him. "I'd be glad to stay on a while longer." As spring deepened, the land began to wake from winter's grip. Wildflowers dotted the prairie, and the trees around Zara's property leafed out in vibrant green. Together, they planted her garden, expanded the chicken coop, and began discussing the possibility of adding a few head of cattle. Garrett found himself thinking less and less about rebuilding his own place. The river could flood again, and the prospect of starting completely from scratch was daunting. But more than that, he realized he'd come to enjoy Zara's company, her quiet strength, her dry humor that emerged more frequently as she grew comfortable with him, the way she hummed softly while kneading bread. These small things drew him in a way he hadn't expected. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Zara broke a comfortable silence. "Why haven't you married, Garrett?" she asked, her question direct, but her tone gentle. The question caught him off guard. "Never found the right woman, I suppose. Or maybe I was too busy trying to make something of myself to notice if I did." She nodded thoughtfully. "Jacob and I married young. Sometimes I wonder if we rushed because we were afraid of being separated when he decided to come west." "Do you regret it?" Garrett asked. "No," she said without hesitation. "Even knowing how it would end, I'd choose those 5 years with him over a lifetime of wondering what might have been." She paused, then added softly, "But grief is a strange companion. It changes shape over time." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of mutual loneliness, perhaps, or the beginning of something neither was ready to name. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders appeared on the path to the house, their silhouettes dark against the fading light. Garrett stood, instinctively moving to place himself between Zara and the approaching strangers. His hand hovered near his gun. As the riders drew closer, Garrett recognized the man in the center as Edgar Bellamy. The 2 flanking him were rough-looking men Garrett hadn't seen before. "Evening, Mrs. Thomas," Bellamy called as they reined in their horses. "Mr. Wade." His tone was polite, but there was an undercurrent of tension. "Mr. Bellamy," Zara acknowledged, standing beside Garrett now. "What brings you out this way after sundown?" "Business, I'm afraid," Bellamy said. "I've come to discuss the matter of your property once more." "As I've said repeatedly, it's not for sale," Zara replied firmly. Bellamy sighed as if disappointed. "I had hoped to avoid unpleasantness, but you leave me no choice. I've acquired the note on your property from the bank in Cheyenne." Zara's face paled. "That's impossible. Jacob paid off half that loan before he died, and I've made every payment since." "Ah, but there were certain conditions in the fine print. interest rates that adjusted after 3 years. Your payment last month was insufficient." "That's robbery," Garrett interjected, anger rising. "No judge would uphold such terms." Bellamy's smile was cold. "Perhaps not. But by the time any legal challenge could be mounted, Mrs. Thomas would be ruined by legal fees." He turned his attention back to Zara. "I'm prepared to forgive the debt entirely in exchange for a clean deed transfer, or you can pay the outstanding balance of $400 by the end of the month." $400 might as well have been $4,000. It was an impossible sum for a woman making her living selling eggs and preserves. "This isn't legal," Zara insisted, but her voice trembled slightly. "I assure you it is. The papers are all in order." Bellamy nodded to one of his companions, who tossed an envelope onto the porch. "Review them yourself. You have until the end of the month." With that, he tipped his hat and turned his horse, his men following as they rode away. Zara's hands shook as she picked up the envelope. Inside were legal documents that, to Garrett's untrained eye, appeared legitimate. The terms were indeed as Bellamy had stated. The interest had nearly doubled after 3 years, making Zara's regular payments insufficient to cover even the interest, let alone reduce the principal. "He's been planning this," she said, sinking onto the porch step. "Waiting for me to miss a payment or make one late." Garrett sat beside her, his mind racing. "We'll find a way," he promised, though he had no idea how they would raise such a sum in less than 30 days. That night, after Zara had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, Garrett sat at her kitchen table, examining the loan documents more carefully. There had to be a way out of this trap. $400 was more money than most people in the territory saw in a year. The next morning, Garrett rode into town alone. His first stop was the telegraph office, where he sent messages to contacts from his Army days who had gone into banking or law. Then, he visited the saloon, where men gathered and gossip flowed as freely as whiskey. What he learned there confirmed his suspicions. Bellamy had been systematically acquiring land throughout the county, using similar tactics with other property owners. He had the local sheriff in his pocket and had brought in hired guns from Colorado to intimidate those who resisted. As Garrett nursed a whiskey, he overheard a conversation between 2 miners at a nearby table. "Heard there's a big poker game at Bellamy's place tomorrow night," one said. "Some cattle buyers from Kansas City are in town with heavy purses." "Fat chance of getting in on that," his companion replied. "Invitation only, and the buy-in is steep." Garrett's attention sharpened. A high-stakes poker game might offer a slim chance to raise the needed funds. During the war, he'd developed a reputation as a skilled card player with an unreadable face. It was a long shot, but perhaps their only one. Returning to Zara's place, he found her in the garden, aggressively pulling weeds as if she could uproot her problems along with them. "Got some information in town," he said, kneeling beside her, "and maybe the beginnings of a plan." That evening, they sat at the kitchen table, while Garrett explained what he'd learned and his idea to enter the poker game at Bellamy's. "It's too dangerous," Zara protested. "Bellamy would recognize you immediately." "Not necessarily," Garrett countered. "I've been thinking about that. I could clean up, wear different clothes, present myself as a cattle buyer's representative from Kansas City." "And the buy-in? You said yourself it would be substantial." Garrett hesitated. "I have a gold pocket watch that belonged to my father. It's the one thing I always carry on my person, so it survived the flood. It's not worth $400, but it might get me into the game." Zara was quiet for a long moment. "I have something too," she finally said. Rising, she went to a loose floorboard beneath her bed and pried it up, retrieving a small wooden box. Inside was a pearl necklace and matching earrings. "Jacob gave these to me on our wedding day. They belonged to his mother." Her voice caught. "I've never been able to bring myself to sell them, even in the leanest times." "Zara, no, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking, I'm offering." She closed the box and placed it in his hands. "This land was our dream. I won't let Bellamy steal it without a fight." The next day, Garrett rode to the nearest large town, 30 miles away, where he wouldn't be recognized. There, he sold the jewelry and his watch to a discreet jeweler, receiving a fair price that would cover the poker buy-in with a small amount left over. He also purchased new clothes, a tailored suit, polished boots, and a silk cravat. The barber gave him a clean shave and trimmed his hair. When he looked in the mirror afterward, he barely recognized himself. Gone was the rugged cowboy. In his place stood a gentleman who might plausibly represent Eastern interests. Returning to Zara's place after dark, he found her anxiously waiting on the porch. "Well," she asked as he dismounted. "Got $300 for the jewelry and watch combined," he reported. "And this." He gestured to his new appearance. Zara's eyes widened. "I hardly recognize you." "That's the idea." He handed her $50, keeping the rest for the game. "Hide this somewhere safe. If things go wrong tomorrow night, it's something to fall back on." "Be careful, Garrett," she said, her concern evident. "Bellamy is dangerous. If he realizes who you are—" "He won't," Garrett assured her, though his confidence was more for her benefit than a reflection of his true feelings. The next evening, Garrett rode to Bellamy's mansion on the outskirts of town. It was an ostentatious structure for the frontier, with pillared porches and large windows that glowed with lamplight. Several expensive horses were already tied at the hitching posts. At the door, a burly man checked Garrett's invitation, a forged document based on information he'd gleaned in town, and accepted his buy-in. Inside, the house was lavishly furnished with imported carpets, oil paintings, and furniture that must have cost a fortune to transport west. In the main parlor, several men were already gathered around a large table, drinks in hand as they waited for the game to begin. Bellamy stood near the fireplace, conversing with a heavy-set man in an expensive suit. Taking a glass of whiskey from a passing servant, Garrett adopted the persona he'd created George Wilson, representing cattle interests from Kansas City. He engaged in small talk with the other players, carefully avoiding direct interaction with Bellamy. When the game began, Garrett took his seat, focusing on the cards and not the man who sat across from him, the man who was trying to steal Zara's future. The stakes were high from the start, with minimum bets that would have made most working men blanch. Garrett played conservatively at first, folding when his hands were weak, betting modestly when they were strong. He lost small amounts and won slightly larger ones, gradually building his pile of chips while observing the other players' habits and tells. Bellamy was an aggressive player who seemed to believe his wealth entitled him to win. He bet heavily even on mediocre hands and grew visibly frustrated when others didn't fold to his bluffs. 3 hours into the game, the stakes had risen dramatically. Several players had already busted out, leaving just Garrett, Bellamy, and 2 others at the table. Garrett had nearly doubled his initial buy-in, but it still wasn't enough. Then came the hand that would change everything. Garrett was dealt a pair of aces. The flop revealed another ace and 2 kings. 3 of a kind was strong, but with 2 kings showing, he had to consider that another player might have the 4th king, giving them a full house. The betting went around the table, with one player folding immediately. The second remaining player, a cattle buyer named Hodgson, bet heavily. Bellamy raised, his eyes gleaming with confidence. When the action came to Garrett, he hesitated, making a show of deliberation before calling. The turn card was a 9, which didn't help his hand. Hodgson bet again. Bellamy raised substantially, and Garrett called once more. The river card was the 4th ace, giving Garrett 4 of a kind, a nearly unbeatable hand. Hodgson checked, passing the action to Bellamy, who bet an enormous sum, nearly half his remaining chips. This was the moment Garrett had been waiting for. He pushed all his chips into the center of the table. "I'm all in." Bellamy's eyes narrowed. "You're either bluffing or you've got a full house. Either way, I call." He matched Garrett's bet. Hodgson folded, leaving just the 2 of them in the hand. 4 aces, Garrett said quietly, turning over his cards. Bellamy's face contorted with rage as he revealed his hand, kings full of 9s, a strong hand, but not strong enough. "Impossible," he sputtered as Garrett pulled the massive pot toward himself. "Just the luck of the draw," Garrett replied evenly, though his heart was racing. He now had well over the $400 needed to pay off Zara's loan, but Bellamy wasn't finished. "I don't know who you really are, Mr. Wilson, but no Kansas City cattle representative plays cards like that." His eyes suddenly widened in recognition. "Wade, it's you, isn't it? Cleaned up and playing dress-up." Garrett maintained his composure. "I believe I'll cash out now," he said, standing and gathering his chips. "Nobody leaves until I say so," Bellamy growled, signaling to his men who stood near the doors. The other players exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Is there a problem, Edgar?" one of the cattle buyers asked. "The man won fair and square. I was watching the deal." Bellamy hesitated, aware of the witnesses. "No problem," he finally said, his voice tight. "Cash him out." Garrett received his winnings, nearly $600, and made his way to the door, every nerve in his body alert for trouble. Once outside, he mounted his horse and rode swiftly away, taking a circuitous route back to Zara's place in case he was followed. It was past midnight when he arrived. Despite the late hour, a lamp still burned in the window, and Zara emerged from the cabin the moment she heard hoofbeats. "Garrett," she called anxiously. "It's me," he confirmed, dismounting and striding toward her. "We did it, Zara. We got the money and then some." Her face lit with disbelief and hope. "All of it? Truly?" In answer, he placed the money in her hands, more cash than she'd likely ever held at once. "Oh, Garrett," she breathed, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need for thanks, but we're not safe yet," he cautioned, leading her inside. "Bellamy recognized me toward the end. He won't take this loss lying down." They stayed up late into the night, counting the money and discussing their next move. The loan could be paid off now, but Bellamy's grudge wouldn't be so easily settled. "We should go to Cheyenne," Garrett suggested. "Pay off the loan directly at the main bank, get proper documentation, and maybe consult a lawyer about Bellamy's tactics." Zara agreed, and they planned to leave at first light. But as dawn approached, the sound of multiple horses approaching broke the pre-dawn silence. Garrett peered out the window, his expression grim. "Bellamy and his men, 6 of them." He turned to Zara. "Take the money and hide in the root cellar. Whatever happens, stay there until they're gone." "I won't leave you to face them alone," she protested. "Zara, please. The money is what matters now. It's your future." When she still hesitated, he added more softly, "I can't protect you and fight them at the same time. Please." Finally, she nodded, gathering the money and heading for the trap door in the kitchen floor that led to the small root cellar beneath the house. Garrett checked his revolver and positioned himself by the window, ready to defend the home that, he realized with sudden clarity, had come to mean as much to him as the one he'd lost. The riders stopped in the yard, Bellamy at their head. "Wade," he shouted, "come out and face me like a man." "What do you want, Bellamy?" Garrett called back, staying inside. "You cheated me, and you're trespassing on property that will soon be mine. Come out, or we'll burn you out." Garrett weighed his options. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but the cabin offered some protection. "This property belongs to Mrs. Thomas, and she's paid her debts in full." Bellamy laughed coldly. "Not yet, she hasn't. And she won't get the chance." One of Bellamy's men dismounted, carrying what looked like a bottle with a rag stuffed in it of firebomb. Garrett knew he had to act. "Hold your fire!" he shouted, opening the door with his hands raised. "Let's talk this through." Bellamy sneered. "There's nothing to discuss. You humiliated me in my own home, and now you'll pay both of you." "The law won't look kindly on 6 men attacking a woman's homestead," Garrett warned, stepping onto the porch. "The law?" Bellamy scoffed. "I am the law in this county." "Not anymore, you ain't." The new voice came from behind Bellamy's group. Everyone turned to see Sheriff Mills and 6 deputies approaching, rifles raised. "What's the meaning of this, Mills?" Bellamy demanded. "These people are trespassers." "Funny thing, Mr. Bellamy," Mills said, his voice steady. "I received a telegraph from the U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne yesterday. Seems they've been investigating reports of land fraud across the territory. Your name came up repeatedly." The sheriff's expression hardened. "And now I find you threatening decent folks with firebombs before sunrise. That doesn't look good." Bellamy's face reddened with fury. "You can't arrest me. I own half this county." "Maybe so, but you don't own me anymore," Mills replied. "Deputies, disarm these men." A tense standoff ensued, with Bellamy's men clearly calculating whether to fight or surrender. Ultimately, faced with the deputies' rifles and legal authority, they chose to surrender, dropping their weapons. As the deputies led Bellamy and his men away, Sheriff Mills approached Garrett. "Marshall's been building a case against him for months. Your telegraph to your Army friend in Cheyenne was the final piece they needed." "My telegraph?" Garrett asked, confused. "I just asked for legal advice about the loan." Mills smiled slightly. Your friend happens to work for the marshal's office now. He connected the dots with other complaints they'd received. After the sheriff departed, promising to send deputies to escort them safely to Cheyenne the next day, Garrett helped Zara from the root cellar. Is it over? She asked, still clutching the money. It seems so, Garrett replied, hardly believing it himself. Bellamy's being arrested for fraud and attempted arson, among other charges. Zara's relief was palpable. Then we're safe. The land is safe. Yes, Garrett agreed, suddenly aware of how naturally he'd included himself in her future. Zara, She stepped closer, placing a finger gently over his lips. You came into my life when I thought I would always be alone, she said softly. You fought for this land as if it were your own. It feels like home, he admitted, more than my own place ever did. Then stay, she whispered, not as a hired hand or a guest, but as... She faltered, perhaps afraid of pushing too far too fast. Garrett took her hands in his. As a partner, a husband eventually, if you'll have me. Her eyes glistened with tears, but her smile was radiant. Yes, to both. He pulled her close, kissing her with all the emotion that had been building over their weeks together. Tenderness, respect, and a love that had grown so gradually he hadn't recognized it until it was fully formed. The next day they rode to Cheyenne under the protection of 2 deputies. At the main bank, they paid off the loan in full and received proper documentation, confirming Zara's ownership, free and clear. A visit to a reputable lawyer ensured that Bellamy's fraudulent practices would be fully exposed and that their land would be protected from future claims. 3 months later, on a perfect summer day, Garrett and Zara were married in the small church in Whispering Pines. The town had rallied around them after Bellamy's arrest, many residents coming forward with their own stories of his intimidation and fraud. As they spoke their vows, Garrett reflected on how a devastating flood had ultimately led him to greater happiness than he'd ever known. He had lost a homestead, but found a home not just in the physical place, but in Zara's heart. That evening, as they sat on the porch of their cabin, for it was truly theirs, now watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues, Zara leaned against his shoulder. Do you ever miss your place by the river? She asked. Garrett considered the question seriously. I miss what I built there, the work of my hands. But no, I don't miss the place itself. He turned to look at her. Everything I need is right here. Over the following years, they expanded the farm into a successful ranch. They added cattle and horses, built a larger home, and hired hands to help with the increasing workload. 2 years after their marriage, Zara gave birth to a daughter they named Emma, followed 2 years later by a son they called Jacob, in honor of the man whose memory Zara still respected. Garrett never rebuilt his homestead by the river. Instead, he and several neighbors constructed a series of levees and water breaks to protect the valley from future floods. The land where his cabin had stood became a communal grazing area for the town's livestock. Bellamy spent 5 years in prison for his crimes before being released and leaving the territory, his empire dismantled and his reputation in ruins. The bank was taken over by honest men who restructured unfair loans and worked with farmers and ranchers during difficult times. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Garrett presented Zara with a pearl necklace and earrings to replace those they had sold. Though finer than the originals, they meant something different, not a memory of what was lost, but a symbol of what they had built together. Do you have any regrets? He asked as he fastened the necklace around her neck. Zara turned to face him, touching his cheek gently. Only that we didn't find each other sooner. We found each other exactly when we needed to, he replied, drawing her close. When the flood washed away everything I thought mattered, it cleared the path to what truly did. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, the distant sound of the river, a gentle reminder of both destruction and renewal, Garrett knew with absolute certainty that he had finally found where he belonged. Not in a place, but in the arms of a woman whose strength had sheltered him when he had nothing, and whose love had given him everything. Years would pass, children would grow, and the small settlement would become a proper town. Through droughts and harsh winters, through prosperity and lean times, Garrett and Zara faced it all together, their bond only strengthening with each challenge overcome. The flood that had once seemed like the end of Garrett's world had instead been the beginning of a life richer than he could have imagined, proof that sometimes what appears to be devastation is merely the clearing away of what was to make room for what could be. In the arms of the widow who had once greeted him with a shotgun, Garrett Wade had found not just shelter, but a love that would weather any storm life might bring. And in the cowboy who had lost everything, Zara had found the courage to open her heart again, proving that even the deepest wounds can heal when tended with care and patience. Together, they had transformed loss into legacy, building something neither could have created alone, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the healing power of love.